Hi guys, and welcome to session 3 of God's Great Love Story. Today we'll be discussing the history books that we just covered in week 2, and we'll be preparing to get excited for the wisdom books of week 3. So if we're going to be talking about history today, I think it's an important question to ask, why is history even important? So personally, I'm a huge nerd and I love history. My husband, on the other hand, kind of lives by the philosophy of we're living in the present moment, the past is the past, why do we even need to learn this stuff? I kind of get his point, but I think that there's still some value in knowing where you come from. So 10 years ago, it was the night before my wedding, and we were at the rehearsal dinner. My aunt took me aside and handed me a package that she was really excited for me to open. And I was excited too, seeing her enthusiasm. I wondered what exciting thing must be inside. Was it something shiny or expensive or especially sentimental? I opened it and it was this. It was a brown, old, kind of broken in journal. And I love journaling, but I have to admit, it didn't exactly wow me seeing her enthusiasm beforehand. I did politely thank her and hugged her and started to walk back to my guests. And she realized that I didn't really understand the full impact of the gift. Open it, she said. So I did. And it took me about half a page to realize this was not an ordinary journal. This was a book full of handwritten stories of my family's history, dating back to the 16th century. It was amazing. My aunt had worked so hard to write down these stories of herself and my parents and my grandparents, my great-grandparents, dating all the way back to a Virginian named Victoria who is incredibly sassy. I realized the thoughtful impact of this book and how important it was that these stories never be forgotten. I solemnly promised to write a similar history for my kids one day, and I started to reflect on the fact that it really is important that we know where we come from. It helps us know where we're going. As Judeo-Christians, we all come from the same spiritual family, and it's essential for us to understand what that family went through in the past to get to where it is today. It's essential for us to understand those Old Testament stories to see why Jesus needed to come in the first place. And it's also important for us to realize why we recognize names like Samson, Daniel, and Elijah thousands of years later. Jesus came because the people were desperate without him. We recognize those names because those folks demonstrated strength and faithfulness at a time when those virtues were hard to come by. Among those faithful few was a woman named Grandma Ruth. This was the great-grandma of King David, as you read this week, and she lived during the time of Judges, which can only be described as a free-for-all. At this time, Israel had settled into the Promised Land but had very loose leadership. The nation had already begun a toxic cycle of falling away from God's commands and crying out for grace whenever the Lord started to deliver any consequences for that disobedience. It was a time suffocated by sin, and Ruth was a breath of fresh air. Ruth wasn't born as an Israelite, but she married into the family, and she followed God's commands better than many naturally born Hebrews. When her husband died, she set aside her own grief to take care of her mother-in-law, who had also been recently widowed. Even when her mother-in-law insisted that she return to her parents and go back home for a better life, Ruth stayed. Now, I know many women who struggle to hang out with their mother-in-laws for a few hours on Thanksgiving, but Ruth volunteered to stay with hers for the rest of her life. Later on, a love story begins to unfold between Ruth and Boaz. Ruth meets this nice man and knows what she wants, and this part kind of cracks me up. She proposes to him. So not only is Ruth completely unselfish and not at all intimidated by her mother-in-law, but she's also a bit of a feminist, about 3,000 years before it was really at all acceptable to be. What a cool lady this was. I'm convinced that there is a reason that God chose Grandma Ruth to be the matriarch of the family that would change the world. She instilled in her sons and grandsons a belief that loving God was the most important thing, and loving others is just about as important. She taught them to work hard even when they didn't feel like it. She taught them to be confident and never selfish or prideful. She taught them to stand up for God and their family. In the midst of chaos, God planted Ruth as a seed that would bear an entire orchard. From her humble family would come David, Solomon, Hezekiah, Josiah, and even Jesus. She's the grandma of kings. As we move forward to the life of those kings, we meet young David, who is a shepherd boy and the baby of his family, totally overlooked by his father and brothers. No one really expected much of him. No one expected him to become a mighty, charismatic war hero who slayed giants and won the trust of an entire nation. But that's exactly what he did. And expanding on that legacy, his son Solomon became the wisest and most successful monarch that the world had ever seen. At this point in the story, everything is looking up for the nation of Israel and the legacy of Grandma Ruth. Unfortunately, it kind of falls apart from there. Solomon's immature son begins a chain of events that leads to the division of the kingdom, and many more unworthy kings lead the nation away from God and ultimately lead both Israel and Judah into exile. In Judah, there are a handful of inspiring, capable, amazing kings that rise to power. Hezekiah and Josiah are two of my favorites. However, it's too little too late at that point. The people have forgotten God and have turned to idols. Despite God trying to warn them and pull them back toward his guidance and protection, the nation brings destruction upon themselves. Fortunately, the story doesn't end here either. Hope still exists in the middle of this dark time. While in exile, the surviving Hebrews remember the God who brought them there in the first place. The Persian emperor finally allows them to return home and rebuild. God protects them as they experience a fresh start. This story is full of ups and downs, and I hope you can see that regardless of what the nation was facing, God was reaching out to them every step of the way. During times of victory, God was smiling upon his people and enhancing their blessings. When the people fell into sin and self-destruction, God was still there, begging his children to return to him and prevent destruction. In your discussion today, I invite you to process some of the stories that stood out to you this week and consider how God showed up for the faithful individuals of Israel, regardless of what the nation was facing as a whole. The complex historical saga of week 2 was understandably a lot to take in. But week 3 will pause that historical roller coaster to focus on the spiritual lessons several prominent leaders learned in their lifetimes. By drawing wisdom from Job, David, and Solomon, we'll learn a little bit about how we might face ups and downs in our own life and how we might lean on God regardless of our circumstances. I have a challenge for you this week, and that challenge is to go beyond a logical understanding of the passages in these wisdom books and seek the deep emotional and spiritual truths that the authors are writing about. Really try to examine the heart of these writers and their perspectives. As you do that, my hope is that you'll also discover something about the heart of God and how he relates to us. When you read the book of Job, recognize that when Job speaks to his friends and to God, he's crying out for help. This is a man in pain, and all he wants is support and understanding. When you read his story, listen to him as if you would listen to a friend going through a similar circumstance. When you read the epic songbook called Psalms, recognize that David and the other songwriters who compiled this book really poured out their hearts to share their deepest experiences and emotions related to life and faith. As you read their words, remember that these are heartfelt, vulnerable song lyrics that share personal stories and reveal eternal truths. Think of the musical artists that you respect and enjoy, and imagine them singing these songs with their fullest level of passion and emotion. When you read Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, know that these are books of advice from a father to a son. Picture your own parent or mentor speaking these words to you to tap into the personal, intimate nature of these words. When you read Song of Songs, read it as a simple, beautiful love story between two people who are crazy about each other. Reflect on how cool it is that God created human beings with the capacity to care about each other so deeply. I think our capacity for love and relationship is one way that God shows us how much He loves us. Thank you for reading, and thank you for listening. I hope you have a great discussion and a great week ahead. See you next time.